Why are car prices still so high? All these so-called car experts projected that by the time we hit the end of 2022, we would be into the lower car prices that we saw back in the end of 2020 before this whole show started. That's not happening at all. Have you looked at recent car lots lately? Have you seen car prices? New car prices have risen, and even used car prices have only dropped marginally, only to be expecting to surge back higher again. And this may actually represent the time you want to buy, but why are they so expensive? Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. 2021 and 22 saw a steep increase in the cost of vehicles, somewhat because of supply and demand, and people were competing for the same vehicle. And also, we can't forget about the semiconductor chip shortage that we saw throughout that last couple of years, which caused a limit to the amount of vehicles that manufacturers could actually put out, essentially, to the marketplace. So with much smaller supply and a much bigger demand, what you have was a recipe for the perfect storm, and that meant car prices started to escalate. Of course, you were competing with Joe next to you, who, if you didn't buy the car, he would buy it right after you walked out the door. So you didn't have a lot of time to think about it, as well as you were often competing with others who were equally motivated to buy that new car. Sure, so that time has come and gone, and so-called experts in the field have predicted that it would have a much bigger rebounding effect, but that's not necessarily the case. Yes, prices have stabilized and leveled off. Yeah, car prices have literally started to flatline a little bit. You're starting to see a few more cars on the car lot, specifically on the used car sector, as well as in February, there was actually a slight dip downwards into the overall average cost of new vehicles. And so it seemed like we were on the right track, but projections now have changed a little bit. And there's some real reasons for that. So if you think that we're getting past this, think again, because we're about to embark on a new surge and an elevated price market on these vehicles, both new and used. So according to Kelley Blue Book, back in 2020, before this whole story began, the average new car price sold for about $37,876. That's right. That was the blended average of the new car price. But now, in recent months, what we're seeing is Kelley Blue Book is now stating the average new vehicle selling is way up to about $48,763. So even though we saw a bit of a dip down, we're still way above that baseline that we saw back pre this massive course adjustment that we just experienced in 21 and 22. I can literally speak from my own experience. Back at the beginning of 2022, I bought myself a slightly used Jaguar F-Type. It was a 2018, and I picked that car up for $70,000 plus taxes. Guess what? 3 years later, and as well, I scour the market now, and I'm seeing other models, the F-Type R like that of 2018 generation, similar mileage or even more, and now I'm seeing those vehicles in that $75,000, $80,000, $85,000 Canadian range, and that means it's actually gone up, and I've owned the car for 3 years, and I've put a bunch of miles on it, so clearly car prices have gone up, and that's on a used car segment. New cars, it's the same storyline. Now, sadly, the used car market hasn't helped much either. They're averaging at $26,510 for your average used car vehicle in today's market. The K factor is up from it was before this whole crap show began 3 years ago. So now here, as we enter the spring of 2023, most people would argue that semiconductors are back online. And for the most part, other than the odd hiccup that you're going to find, that there's very few gaps in the production levels of modern manufacturers, and they're still able to service the majority of the requests by the consumer. Now, I can say this as well. The other day I had to go into a car dealer. I needed a second key. They quoted me double what it was before 3 years ago for the cost of that new key fob because of the electronics inside and the shortcoming that you're finding in that market. So it's not just affecting the new vehicles, but it's accessories as well. So clearly, this semiconductor shortage is no longer quite a shortage, but it's still at a premium and you're paying for it in one way or another. So part of the problem is when you look at cars like this behind me here, the reality is, because we went through such a long gap where you couldn't get vehicles, even though now they're starting to play catch up, they're actually producing vehicles. You walk into a dealership and you're able to sign the paycheck on one of these vehicles and get that vehicle, get the keys and drive away. The reality is that doesn't happen for everyone because that big gap in time meant that there's still a backlog. There's still that gap in the industry where people just could not get those vehicles, and they'll never really probably ever catch up. Everything is at an escalated price because that gap will never be overcome. And now with the transformation into the EV marketplace, the idea of getting yourself into an ICE or internal combustion vehicle represents a much taller challenge. So a big part of the reason a lot of the vehicle prices have averaged up is because a lot of the manufacturers have now prioritized which vehicles they're putting their efforts in. Obviously, why would you beat a dead horse and put a bunch of efforts into selling cars that have little to no profit margin when you can make a ton of money by actually selling a car that you have a huge profit margin? Well, for example, we're looking at here is a Nissan Altima, and that's exactly what they did. For example, the Nissan Versa, which is a car people were really looking for because it's great on fuel, it's cheap to buy in, and when car prices were really high, people just needed something cheap and dirty to get around. But instead of doing that, Nissan said, no, we're gonna hatchet that. We're gonna knock down sales by about 78%, and instead we're gonna put some of the efforts in the microprocessor and the chips into the vehicles like the Altima as well as the Maxima, and these vehicles are the ones that show most profit. So clearly they're averaging up because manufacturers are making the decided choice to put the money and the chips and the efforts and the profit margins out to the consumer or the customer, and you end up paying the price at the end of the road. This is a classic example. We also had car brands like Toyota, like this, a little Corolla. Clearly they make more money with their upper vehicles like an Avalon or some of their SUVs. So why would they put lots of efforts to sell tons of these? Especially when Toyota halted production for extended periods of time due to the factory shutdowns. Now as playing catch up, it's harder to find these, not just on the new car market, but certainly on the used car market. Yes, you can go into the dealership and yeah, you can put your money down on a Corolla today, but there's still a backlog. And if you thought you're gonna buy a used one, good luck. You probably won't find too many slightly used versions like this laying around that are 2 or 3 years of age where you think you're gonna get in a great car for a great deal. Probably not gonna happen. Toyota took the conservative game and ended up restricting the amount of vehicles that they sold during that last 2 years, and it just made it difficult for certain consumers that love certain manufacturers like Toyota. Manufacturers love to sell vehicles like BMW. We have the X5. There's a huge profit margin there, as well as Porsche, luxury brands. SUVs of every size and make typically have a slightly higher profit margin because they're more costly. There's more money buried in there, and they could sell it for a little more money because people want that. They're highly desirable as well as they're highly sought after. But it doesn't just begin and end with manufacturers choosing the new vehicles they sell. Those new vehicles become used in a couple of years. And so what you have on the used car market are a high prevalence of used luxury vehicles or high-end vehicles like SUVs and trucks. And even vehicles like this eventually spill over on the used car market. So what you have there is the unavailability of finding a whole prevalence of used low-cost vehicles. And instead you're getting a lot more choices like this. Range Rovers, other SUVs like that. We also have Volkswagens like the Taos there, as well as more Jaguars parked over there. The Mustang slightly upscale as well, and Fiats, of course, they've got to sell cars. Now here's a couple of exceptions, but they're Chevys, and nonetheless you won't find these laying around, and the only reason they are is because they're poorly made and problematic. Hondas, you won't find too many Civics laying around either, and as well Mercedes did very, very well during this last couple of years because most of their cars made a lot of money, specifically the E-Class and S-Class vehicles. We can't forget about the infamous G-Wagon, which almost doubled in price from the beginning to the end of this last 2 or 3 years. I mean, more examples that are selling high on the used car market. BMWs are never all that cheap. Audis are also pricier. Mini is a BMW product, and Jeeps have the highest resale after a 5-year time frame, so you know they're going to hold a lot of value, and the manufacturers are making a killing. Nissan, again, SUVs all over the place are making the money. So these vehicles were all new, and they were all big bucks, and they had high profit margins. So unfortunately, that's why you're finding a lot of these types of vehicles and the used car market that spills over. So good luck in finding yourself a nice little Nissan Versa or some other little subcompact for cheap and with low miles. They're out there, but they're like a needle in a haystack. So our friends and experts over at Cox Automotive ran some numbers, and from 2017 all the way up to 22 at the end in December, they assessed the number of vehicles being sold that were worth under 25 grand brand new, went from 13% of the market down to 4% of the market. So in other words, almost no cars under 25 grand were being sold by the end of last year. The flip side is vehicles over $60,000, the market flopped and skyrocketed in a direction that showed that people were spending a lot more. Those pricier vehicle segment went from 8% up to 25% of the market is now paying over 60 grand for a new vehicle. It's absolute bananas. The worst part is modern day manufacturers are starting to see the light. They're realizing much higher margins today than they've ever been means that they don't need to sell as many vehicles. So they're not pushing that out. They keep pawning off the higher profit margin vehicles. I could speak to a blog I heard recently where the top pop, the CEO over at Dodge, had actually commented that We don't need to sell more vehicles. We need to sell pricier vehicles with a higher margin that are going to equate to the same dollars in the pocket. They don't need to hustle as many low margin vehicles along as the high margin vehicles, and they can still come out looking rosy, making more money, or at the very least make the same amount of money with far fewer vehicles being pitched. So it just means a win-win for the dealer and a lose-lose for the consumer. And this trend clearly is not going to end anytime soon, because manufacturers have recognized this and they're all getting on board with that. And that's why we're going to start to see another sharp increase. This whole trend is being adopted, and that's just what we're going to have to expect. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, and it depends how your perspective looks, but at the end of the day, internal combustion engines are going to be a thing of the past. Sadly, regulators are making them slowly disappear. Trying to get your hands on what's left of the internal combustion engine going to mean prices will continue skyrocketing. That's inevitable. That's just the way it's going to be. You will anticipate continually elevated prices for internal combustion engine. The flip side is, if you're one of those fans of electric vehicles, have you seen Tesla lately doing all kinds of price slashes because they're trying to compete with all of the new players hitting the block, bringing out new products? And of course, if you're looking for value for your money, you're going to eventually start to see it more in the electric vehicle marketplace. So if you're okay with a battery operated vehicle, that's where some of the prices will start to decline, and those are the opportunities. If you don't like them, you're just gonna have to pay the piper. If you want an internal combustion engine, that's your choice. I love ICE as well, but the reality to get one, you're gonna have to pay a continued escalating price tag. And with all of that said, check that out right there, everybody. If you're in the market for a used car and you don't want to get ripped off by a piece of junk, there's a list of 5 vehicles you definitely don't want to even consider buying, because it will cause you a world of pain. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll catch you all real soon. Bye-bye. Get your merch at Exotic Car Play Place under Get Our Gear. You're going to love it. Join the ECPP community.